Thanks for coming, Amie. Now, Amie has worked for Birds Canada as the British Columbia Motus Wildlife Tracking System Coordinator. And prior to joining Birds Canada, she studied red knots on the James Bay and Ontario coast as a graduate student. She also spent several years working as a field technician, primarily with shorebirds on the Bay of Fundy and James Bay, but also with seabirds, passerines, and small mammals on various projects. She loves being out in the field, and she is interested in migration, population ecology, and wildlife conservation. Welcome, Amie. It sounds very interesting. We're looking forward to it.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to speaking with you. Okay, I've got my presentation here, so let me just see if I can set it to share my screen. Okay, you're gonna see a paper I have up for a second, but let me just change that. Okay, now you should be seeing my presentation, I think. Great.
Yeah, you're on.
Excellent, okay. All right, so thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you tonight about Motus. I'm joining you from pretty nearby in Vancouver, where I acknowledge that I'm on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I acknowledge the deep connections to and history of these communities on this land, and I'm grateful for their continued stewardship here. Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems, and we support the needs, aspirations, and rights of Indigenous peoples to care for the land. Thank you for inviting me to speak about Motus, which is an international collaborative endeavor to track the movements of small flying animals. So that's mostly birds, but it's also been used to track bats and even some large insects. And as I mentioned, as Anne mentioned, I work for Birds Canada, and we're a nonprofit for bird conservation, and Motus is one of our big programs in partnership with many other collaborating institutions and organizations. And so this evening, I'm going to give you a bit of background on Motus and talk about how it works and give some examples of some of the really interesting research that's been done using Motus, and talk a little bit about how the system has developed over the last 10 or so years. So the conservation of migratory species can be extremely challenging because it requires considering threats that occur to animals at different stages of their life cycle that typically span multiple jurisdictions, habitats, and landscapes that are often thousands of kilometers apart. So in order to enact effective conservation measures for migratory birds, we have to first figure out where any bottlenecks are occurring and where populations might be limited, and then prioritize where and what conservation actions might have the greatest impact. So I like to use red knot as an example because, as Anne mentioned, I worked on red knots during my master's degree, and so I really love them a lot. And they experienced large declines in the late 90s and early 2000s due to the overharvesting of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay in the eastern US. And so red knots feed on horseshoe crab eggs during their spring migration. They stop in Delaware Bay and they gorge themselves on these horseshoe crab eggs as the horseshoe crabs come ashore to spawn at the same time. And then they build up a ton of fat to fuel their migration to the Arctic, where they breed. And they'll actually double their weight in as little as 2 weeks eating these horseshoe crab eggs, which are really rich in fat. And the horseshoe crabs are also fished for bait, and there was overfishing. And the fishery for horseshoe crabs is much more regulated now, but the red knot populations still haven't recovered after that steep decline in the late 90s and early 2000s. So what is it that's preventing their recovery? Where and when in their annual cycle between their breeding grounds in the Arctic and their wintering grounds as far south as Patagonia are they facing these threats that are preventing recovery? So understanding this full annual cycle of species and how all the seasons and places are linked is really important to effective conservation, but it's challenging for migratory species. So tracking technologies are one of the tools that we can use to give us a lot of insight into an animal's life cycle. And there are many different types of tracking technologies, and the important thing about them is that they're all complementary. There's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. It really depends on what your research question is, what ones you might decide to use. So I'll give you a few examples of the different types of tracking technologies. We have something like geolocators, which you can see on the black pole here. They'll give you a full year of data, and they determine the rough location of a bird based on the day length, because there's a sensor in the geolocator that records light levels. But the downside to them is that they have to be recaptured. The bird has to be recaptured to get the data back. Banding, on the other hand, is quite inexpensive, and compared to a lot of the more high-tech tracking devices, and it's not very invasive, but again, you have to recapture the bird, and the recapture rate is very low. With leg flags, they're similar to bands, but you can resight them with a spotting scope, so your resighting rate is a bit higher than your recapture rate. And then you have things like GPS tags that are very precise, but they only record a limited number of points, so you don't get as much data as something like satellite tags, where the data just gets transmitted to a satellite, but the technology is not there yet to make them small enough for small birds to carry, so you can only put them on larger birds. And then we have radio telemetry, which has smaller tags, so you can put them on smaller birds, but the bird has to pass close by a receiver to get a detection. So how much data you get depends on how much receiver coverage you have. So lots of different options to think about when you're tracking birds. And the Motus Wildlife Tracking System is an international collaborative research network that uses coordinated and automated radio telemetry, so that last type I talked about, to facilitate research and education on the ecology and conservation of migratory animals. And radio telemetry has been used to track animals since the 1960s. And the fundamental concepts haven't changed too much since the 60s, but the technology has developed quite a bit. And essentially how it works is a transmitter emits a signal at a specific frequency, and then it's picked up by an antenna connected to a receiver that's monitoring at that frequency. And these receivers can be in a fixed location, or they can be mobile. So this is a photo of a receiver that's in a car, so there's likely an antenna mounted on the roof of the car. And traditionally, radio transmitters would each operate at a different frequency, so they could be individually identified based on that frequency, and then the receiver would cycle through those frequencies, monitoring for them. Motus, on the other hand, is radio telemetry with a bit of a twist. So the philosophy behind Motus is that we want to be able to harness the collective power of many different individual research projects into one big coordinated effort that can expand the scale and the impact and scope of everyone's work, while at the same time maximizing the research funding that's available. So essentially, we should all be working together. So instead of having the transmitters each operating on different frequencies, with Motus, the transmitters are all on the same frequency, but they can still be individually identified through a digitally encoded ID. So this way, all of the receiver stations in the network are continuously monitoring for all the animals that are carrying these radio transmitters. And that way the system can grow and develop cooperatively so that we can all benefit, and most importantly, we can work collaboratively on our research so that it benefits conservation efforts as much as possible. And of course, researchers can still work on their own independent projects using Motus, but these projects can also be leveraged collectively to hopefully gain more knowledge about the threats that migratory species face. So the advantages of radio telemetry are that these are some of the smallest available devices, and they can weigh as little as 0.2 grams. And so that way they can be put on quite small birds and small bats, those that are too small to carry the larger technologies like satellite tags. They also have very high temporal precision. So when a bird is detected, you know it was there down to the second. And that can be really helpful when you're studying something like departure timing. When do birds leave a stopover site on migration? And under what weather conditions, for example, because you can link up that precise time to the weather conditions. So you also don't need to recapture the bird to get the data back, because the detections are stored on the receiver, not on the transmitter. And when we say that Motus is collaborative and automated, we mean that the receivers are continuously monitoring for transmitters. So they're listening at all times, and then they're working independent of you being there, as opposed to like going out with a handheld antenna and tracking. Also, Birds Canada houses all of the data for any of these projects that are part of Motus. So all the data is integrated into the Motus database, which facilitates collaboration among users and means that we can make visualizations of the data available to the public on the Motus website. And then researchers can access their data through that database. So we can take a closer look at the key components of the system, the animals that get tagged and the receivers that detect them. So first, I'll show you a few examples of the different kinds of radio transmitters that can be used with Motus. There are both solar and battery powered tags. The battery powered tags are the ones that can get super small. They can weigh less than 0.2 grams, but because they're so light, they have a pretty short battery life. And the larger tags last longer. So tags with a larger battery that weigh a bit more are gonna last quite a bit longer than those really small tags. The solar tags are a pretty new introduction to Motus. There's one type, the one in the top left here, that doesn't have a battery at all. It just has this little solar panel on it. And so when that's in the sun or gets enough light, it's going to start transmitting automatically. But this means that it will only transmit during daylight hours. The other type of solar tag in the bottom right here also has a battery incorporated, and these little solar panels that recharge that battery. So it can last indefinitely and transmit at night as well, but it's heavier. It's about 1.5 grams. So only some of the larger birds can carry that one. And then here we've got a red knot, and you can see the little antenna on the transmitter just sticking out over its tail there as it's being released. And then in addition to the transmitters, there are the receiver stations that detect the tagged animals. And as you can see from these pictures, they come in all kinds of different forms in all kinds of places and habitats. So we've got like a mini Motus station in the Montana hills, or these antennas that are attached to a fire tower in Pennsylvania, to a pop-up tower on the New Brunswick coast. And then you can even have them on like the roof of an urban office building in Gatineau. With the right tools and some creativity, anyone can learn to put up a Motus station, and most researchers involved in Motus put up their own stations, as these folks did in the Andes in Colombia, using a tree trunk for a mast. But sometimes we do enlist some help for the trickier ones. The city of Surrey is the one here. They helped us out a bunch to put one up on the Blackie Spit pump station with their bucket truck. So that was awesome that they were able to help us out with that. So basically, to make a Motus station, you need antennas that you can elevate and then fasten securely to a master structure and connect those antennas via cables to the computer part of the receiver. And there are two different types of receiver computers, the sensor station and the sensor gnome. They work very similarly. They're just made by different companies. And they can be connected to the internet or the cell network to transfer data back to the Motus database. or if there isn't any Wi-Fi or cell coverage, you can come and download the data yourself manually. They're also open source software, so if someone was interested in building their own and tinkering with it, they could do so. That's a little beyond my capabilities, but it's certainly something that some folks are involved in. And these receivers can be powered by solar, as you can see in the photo here, that's on the side of a wetland viewing platform, or they can be hooked up to a standard power supply in a regular outlet. You can just plug them in. And under ideal conditions, they can detect a tagged bird up to about 15 kilometers away, or sometimes even more. It really depends on the conditions, though. If you've got a clear line of sight and can get the antennas up high, like this one here, that's a spot in Montana, you can detect birds quite far away. But if you've got like a bunch of vegetation or like a mountainside blocking the view, you will have a much shorter detection range. And this is a map of all the Motus receiver stations as of right now. So it really is an international network at this point. There are over 1,000 Motus stations around the world. And they're mostly in North America, particularly Eastern North America, where the Motus network started. But they're growing a lot in South America and Europe and Australia, and even a couple are starting to come on in Asia as well. So what you have when you put all these tagged animals together with this array of receivers is that the data recorded by the receiver stations reveal animal movement across the landscape. And this is an example of semi-palmated sandpipers and white-rumped sandpipers that were tagged in James Bay in Northern Ontario during southbound migration. So it shows how they moved from the James Bay coast out to the east coast of Canada and the US. And you can see that a number of the semi-palmated sandpipers, which are shown in green here, went into the Bay of Fundy, which is a major stopover site for them. And the white-rumped sandpipers in blue tended to go a little bit further south and not so much into the Bay of Fundy. However, it's not quite as simple as transmitters plus receivers. Since it's an international collaborative network, it requires a lot of infrastructure support and behind the scenes maintenance to keep it all running. So this is just a diagram of how the whole system sort of fits together. You've got researchers and collaborators who are equipping the animals with tracking devices, which are then detected by the receiver stations. The data is then transmitted to the Motus database, where those researchers and collaborators can access it to do analysis that will hopefully contribute to conservation science. And then from the Motus database, the data also gets shared with other data tools and portals, as well as there are there's data summaries on the public interface of the Motus website as well. So as of this week, here's where we're at. There are over 1,300 Motus receiver stations in 31 different countries. Almost 300 species have been tagged, and over 30,000 animals in total have been tagged. And there are over 1,300 partners and collaborators that are involved with Motus, and nearly 150 publications have used Motus in some way. So I thought I wanted to highlight some of the really great research that folks have been doing using Motus. So this is a study that was led by Allie Anderson for her PhD work in James Bay in Northern Ontario, which is a really important stopover site for many species of shorebirds on southbound migration. And the James Bay Shorebird Project maintained 8 Motus stations along the coast. And then there were many, many more Motus stations maintained by various other Motus users to the south of James Bay. So field crews captured shorebirds in James Bay using mist nets at 3 remote field camps along the coast and deployed radio transmitters on 6 different species of shorebirds: white rump sandpipers, semi-palmated sandpipers, least sandpipers, pectoral sandpipers, semi-palmated plovers, and lesser yellowlegs. And they equipped the birds with these radio transmitters. And then Allie found that the birds that were able to put on more fat before they migrated further south made fewer subsequent stops in other parts of North America. So you can see that here on this figure, we've got the relative departure fuel load on the x-axis, which is essentially how much fat the bird is carrying on its body. And then on the y-axis here is the probability that they make another stop south of James Bay before they reach their wintering grounds. So if the birds were carrying less fat, they were more likely to make another stop, whereas if they were carrying a lot of fat, they were much less likely to make another stop. So based on the time elapsed between some detections on Motus stations, this semi-palmated sandpiper appeared to have flown directly or near directly all the way to the northern coast of South America. So shorebirds are capable of making some really impressive long distance flights. It's amazing how they'll double their weight putting on fat during a stopover, and then they'll burn it all and arrive extremely skinny after a multi-day nonstop flight across thousands of kilometers. Similarly, those birds that put on more fat during stopover in James Bay were more likely to be detected again on Motus stations south of James Bay, which suggests potentially that birds in better body condition with more fuel stores were more likely to survive migration, which is a very energetically expensive task. And Allie also found that the birds that, sorry, I went the wrong way there. Allie looked at whether different species behaved differently or showed different migration strategies based on their total migration distance. So in shorebird terms, least sandpipers and semi-palmated plovers are relatively short distance migrants, spending their non-breeding season in the southern US and the Caribbean, so migrating only 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers from James Bay, as opposed to white rump sandpipers and pectoral sandpipers, which migrate up to 9,000 to 11,000 kilometers south of James Bay. So those birds that had a longer total migration, like the white rumps and the pectoral sandpipers, spent longer time on stopover in James Bay, about 3 weeks instead of 2, and put on more fat before they left James Bay than the shorter distance migrants like least sandpiper and semi-palmated plover did. So Allie was able to combine Motus data with body condition data measured when the bird was captured for tagging to find out some really interesting information about migration. And now I'll switch gears and talk briefly about some really amazing research done on thrushes on northbound migration by Dr. Camila Gomez and Dr. Ana Gonzalez, who are researchers with the Colombian NGO Selva. And Dr. Gonzalez has also worked with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So Dr. Gomez studied gray cheek thrushes migrating north from a stopover site in northern Colombia and found that they were making flights of up to 3,000 kilometers from this site. And she also found that birds who were able to put on more fat at that stopover site were able to fly faster and arrive more quickly in North America. So you can see that here in this figure. Again, we've got the amount of fat essentially they're putting on their body on the x-axis, and then the days between a detection in South America and a subsequent detection in North America. So the birds that didn't have much fat, it took longer for them to get to North America, whereas the birds that had a lot of fat, not many days elapsed between when they left South America and then were detected in North America. So work like this shows how important this stopover site in Colombia is for these birds and how protecting habitat like this is really essential to conserving migratory species. Dr. Gonzalez studied Swainson's thrushes on their wintering grounds in Colombia and compared the migration of birds that wintered in native forest versus those that wintered in shade-grown coffee plantations. And the common thinking was that birds wintering in high-quality habitats would be able to leave on migration earlier and then arrive on the breeding grounds earlier and have higher reproductive success. But until recently, with the advent of technologies like Motus, it was difficult to track small birds to test this hypothesis. So Dr. Gonzalez and her colleagues were able to assess the habitat quality and found that native forests were generally of higher quality than shade-grown coffee, but the thrushes wintering in native forest actually left later, not earlier, as was expected. However, the thrushes that left later from those high quality habitats were able to migrate faster and essentially catch up with the early migrants that had left the poorer quality habitats earlier. So this shows that there's more than one strategy for successful migration, and studies like this show how the habitat quality on the wintering grounds can be linked to things like arrival time on the breeding grounds thousands of kilometers away. And I thought I'd just quickly mention a new project that we've started here in British Columbia, so a little closer to home. And we've been adding a few new Motus stations to the ones that were already here in the Fraser Estuary over the last couple of years. And the Motus network locally here has grown a lot. And over the last two winters, we've tagged dunlin in Boundary Bay and out on Roberts Bank to see how much they move between local areas over the winter. Essentially, we want to understand how dunlin move around the estuary and what parts of the area and what habitats they depend on, so we can better advocate for protecting more habitat in the estuary. The tagged dunlin are still out in the estuary, although they'll be getting ready to head north soon. So we still got more data coming in, but we can start to look at some preliminary patterns. And here we've got dunlin that we tagged in Boundary Bay in green on the left, and dunlin that we tagged on Roberts Bank in purple here on the right. And the size of each point represents the number of detections at that Motus station. So what we can see is that the birds are moving between the areas. Birds that were tagged in Boundary Bay haven't necessarily just stayed there. They've also been detected out at Roberts Bank and up at Iona. And likewise, birds tagged at Roberts Bank have been detected in Boundary Bay and even inland a bit as far as this Abbotsford station. So they are moving around, but the distribution isn't even. Certainly there are more detections at Roberts Bank of birds that were tagged there and more detections at Boundary Bay for birds that were tagged in Boundary Bay. We're also working on integrating new technologies to expand the possibilities of what Motus can do. So those solar tags that I mentioned earlier are a recent addition through a collaboration with Cellular Tracking Technologies, which is a wildlife tracking company. However, these tags actually operate at a different frequency than the battery-powered tags, and we want to maintain that advantage of Motus where the birds that you tag can be picked up on all the stations across the network. So we're working on having all the new receiver stations be what we're calling dual mode, so they can detect both types of tags, and upgrading existing stations when we can to monitor for both types of tags. Those the first ones that transmit at 166 megahertz get picked up on these larger antennas, and then the new tags that transmit at 434 megahertz get picked up on these smaller antennas. Another new technology from Cellular Tracking Technologies that we're incorporating is these, what they're calling nodes, which are essentially mini receivers that can be arranged in a grid, and then they transmit any detections back to one big Motus station nearby. So what this allows researchers to do is to look at much finer scale movement. So as the technology Motus uses has expanded, so has the array of receiver stations. So this is a map of the Motus array just under 8 years ago now, in 2014. And you can see that it was largely limited to the East Coast and Southern Ontario. And now here's that map of all of the receiver stations today. So how has it grown this much in, not that many years? In large part, that is thanks to the efforts of regional collaboration groups. And so I'll just mention quickly 2 of them, but one of the earlier regional collaboration groups that really got some of the Motus expansion work started was the Northeast Motus Collaboration. And in early 2017, they saw that there were all these stations in Southern Ontario and then stations on the coast, but there was a big gap in the interior Northeast. So they wanted to fill that gap. So they added about 50 stations over 3 years, mostly in Pennsylvania, but also Maryland and Delaware. And they successfully used fire towers to mount antennas for a lot of these stations, which was a neat design. There are a few different collaboration groups in kind of the Great Plains area and the Intermountain West and the Midwest, but I'll mention the one that is here on the West Coast, which is the Partners in Flight Western Working Group Motus Initiative. And as you can see, we have an ambitious amount of ground to cover, this whole kind of blue outline of the Pacific Flyway. And in 2017, there were very few Motus stations, just a few here around Vancouver in the West. And so the working group came up with a plan for 2021 to fill in all these stations shown in blue here. And so here we are in 2022, and I think they've done a pretty good job to get all their plans to come to fruition with a lot of Motus stations added in the West. Not necessarily exactly in the places that was planned, but I think even in more places. So it's grown tremendously over the last couple of years. So our goal at Motus is to be an example of the power of collaboration. And Birds Canada may be the headquarters for Motus, but we really couldn't do any of this without the regional collaborations and all of the folks that are championing Motus on the ground in their home areas. So I'll leave you with a final example of collaboration. And that's of many independent researchers then pooling their data that they collected on their independent research projects for a study led by Sjoerd Duwens, who was a postdoc with Environment Canada at the time. And he brought the data from 13 different projects together based on that had tagged 4 different species of shorebirds. And he looked at migration speed. And what he found was that all of the species migrated faster in the spring. So the amount of time it took them to get from the non-breeding grounds to the breeding grounds was faster than vice versa in the fall. However, they made longer stopovers in the fall. So they made shorter stops on spring migration and stopped for a lot longer at resting spots and refueling spots in the fall. But in fact, they actually flew faster in the fall. So they had higher flight speeds, but longer stops. So overall, the pace of migration was slower in the fall than in the spring. And it could be that they flew slower in spring to save energy for breeding, or they flew faster in the fall to avoid predators like raptors that migrate a bit later than shorebirds generally do. This is just, I think, a cool example of what you can do with the big data set that spans the continent or the hemisphere when you've got many projects using the same system so that the data can be combined to get more out of it. And at heart, that's what we aim for Motus to be, is community science, a global network of researchers and volunteers and collaborators. And we hope that it can provide robust fine scale information that's applicable, accessible, and hopefully affordable. As well, we want Motus to provide educational opportunities. So there is a Motus education website as well, where we have developed some case studies for students in grade 7 to 12 to learn about bird migration and look at a bit of Motus data and do some activities around that. And a number of schools host Motus stations as well. I think there are 3 schools in BC right now that have Motus stations. And ultimately, we hope that Motus is greater than the sum of its parts and is able to provide relevant information that can help conservation efforts for migratory species. And that is my talk about Motus. So I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have about Motus or about the work that Birds Canada does. Yeah, and thank you so much for your attention and for inviting me to speak to you tonight.
Fantastic stuff, Amie. Great. I love it. I love it. I love it. Love data. Does anyone have questions for Amie? I'm sure we all do. No questions?
I'm going to ask Amie a question. Amie, I see there isn't many Motus stations up in the northern area where the birds come down from along our coastline from the bays up there in Alaska. And so I guess that's your plan in the future. And you raise your money by how do you do it?
Yeah, so there are plans to get more Motus stations up in Alaska. I think there's actually another one that's going to go up in the Copper River Delta sometime in the next week or so. And then there's plans to get some up in Controller Bay, I think, too. And as in terms of funding for Motus stations, like not necessarily all of the funding comes through Birds Canada. It's certainly university researchers, government agencies, they'll use funding to purchase the supplies to build Motus stations and fund the field work that to set them up. So there have been a number of the examples that come to mind are some government agencies in the US. I think the Missouri State Department of Fish and Wildlife has like applied for big grants that can fund like a number of Motus stations in the Midwest, and then also fund some in Central and South America to kind of connect those migration areas to the non-breeding grounds. So a lot of it comes through grant applications and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Karen?
Yes. So how well is the data collected through Motus filling or actually substantiating the hypothesis that most of the experts had already factored for birds in the migration, like not providing any surprises in the big picture and just filling in some details, or what?
I think that it's a mix. Certainly some of the projects are aimed at getting some really detailed fine scale information that we wouldn't necessarily have known or been able to get before. Yeah. But I think there have been some bigger kind of insights, like the thrush work that I mentioned, where the hypothesis was that the earlier arrivals also left the wintering or non-breeding grounds earlier. Actually, they left later but migrated faster. And there's been some work on connectivity done through Motus because of the kind of broad scale of the network. So there's been some interesting and I think fairly quite relevant work on Kirtland's warbler, linking non-breeding grounds in the Bahamas to breeding grounds in Michigan and the Great Lakes area. Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly some of the research that's been done is probably confirming things that are already suspected or known. There's some research that looked at white-crowned sparrows that had been in contact with neonicotinoid pesticides and showed that they left later on migration and couldn't put on as much weight to prepare for migration as quickly, which I think that, certainly a lot of us think, pesticides, not good, not great, but the tracking with Motus did show that there were impacts on birds' ability to migrate.
I believe Cole has a question.
Yes, Cole has two questions actually. One, he wants to know if Birds Canada created Motus, and two, why change the frequency with the new solar powered tags? Why not just use the old frequency stuff?
Yeah, that is a good question. The second question about the frequency change, and to be honest, I don't for sure know the answer to that. I think that in part they use a slightly different way of encoding that unique ID so that we can identify the individual animals. So the way that the tag ID is encoded is slightly different, and that may impact what frequency range they use. But that's honestly a little bit beyond my level of knowledge about radio technology. And it could also be an intellectual property thing because they're different companies, but I'm not sure if that is the case. For the first question, did Birds Canada create Motus? Motus was initially conceived out of Acadia University in Nova Scotia, in partnership with Birds Canada, and kind of as it's grown, Birds Canada has kind of become this central host and houses the database. But yes, it wasn't just Birds Canada that created Motus. Certainly Acadia University, Nova Scotia is like the big impetus to start Motus. Yeah, there's a professor and researchers there, Dr. Phil Taylor and John Brostowski, who came up with some of the original concepts that led to Motus.
Eric, you had a question there?
Is there a way to communicate if you come across a bird that has like an antenna on it? Like I've seen them a number of times on different species, and to assume that they're being tracked might miss that location, because you spoke of some of the transmitters only work when they're charged up, and if they fail, you may miss the data. So is there a way for when we're in the field and we come across, and I've seen it before, like black oyster catchers have antennas with bands on them. If you have a good enough view of the band and the number to report it somewhere.
Yeah, if you can see the band and the number or the combination of color bands, you can report that to the bird banding office in Canada. That's I think there's also reportband.gov for the US, and the North American banding program is all works together, so it's the same network of, or same banding system. So either the Canadian or the US they would both have access to what the data for what bird that is. And then shorebirds with leg flags, and maybe with alphanumeric leg bands as well. There's a website, bandedbirds.org, that tracks shorebird band resightings. So you can look up the individual on there as well, or report a resighting to bandedbirds.org.
The only reason I asked is because I specifically, like, it was the ones with the antennas,
Mhm.
right? And that gets back to you if it's one that you're tracking and let's say it's not working anymore, and there'll be the other organizations will be able to transfer that sighting to you, correct?
Yes, yeah, if
Okay.
you submit a sighting to the banding office or the US Bird Banding Lab, then they will inform the researcher that the bird that they tagged has been recited and where. It doesn't necessarily go back to Motus, it would more so go back to the researcher that's participating in Motus that tagged the bird, but they're generally who would be using the data. So yes, and if you see a bird with a transmitter, you can also reach out to Motus and they may be able to not necessarily narrow it down to individual, but be able to find out who is tagging birds in that area or who might likely have been tracking that bird.
Okay.
Ted, you have a question?
Amie, thanks for this presentation. Two questions sort of combined together. One, where do you determine when another Motus station will go? And how much is an approximate cost to set one up?
Yeah, in terms of determining where one will go, there are a few different factors that play into it. Whether it's a strategic location for detecting birds is a big one, depending on your research objectives. So for the project we're doing where we're tracking Dunlin, when we started the project, there were a few Motus stations out on Roberts Bank, but none in Boundary Bay. And we knew that was an important area. So we wanted to get a couple stations up there to improve our coverage. And we knew that there was a pump house that the city of Surrey had at Blackie's Fit. So we approached them about whether we could install a Motus station there because it had a great view out over the bay. So having that line of sight is important. And we knew that Dunlin used the area. And then, so that's kind of the biological reason. But then in terms of kind of just the feasibility reasons is whether there's a good place to put up a station there, whether there's space or an existing building we can install on, and then whether we can get permission to do it. So certainly whether there's a willing host plays into it as well. And then cost you asked about, it varies depending on the station. Like low end of it is probably $2,000. High end, if you want like really all the bells and whistles, huge tower, could be up to even 10,000. I would say on average for the Motus stations I set up, I usually spend about 4,000 per station to put up 4 antennas, and I do try to make sure they're really solid.
Thank you.
Gareth, you had a question?
Just a quick one. Do you have any stations out on Western Island? And if so, would it be possible for us to visit one and perhaps talk to someone about it next time we do a field trip out to Rifle?
Yeah, there is a Motus station out at the Environment Canada office on Weston Island at Alaxon. So it's on the side, it's on the roof of the barn when you start driving in. So if you go up and then there's the gate where you get into the Environment Canada building, if you go through that gate, and it's the first red barn on the right has a Motus station there.
Would it be possible to get someone to talk to us about it?
I think that the folks at Environment Canada who are using the Motus station there, I think Wendy Easton was the person who got it set up there. So she might be someone to contact. I think it probably could be challenging right now because Environment Canada still has really strict COVID protocols, but maybe if it's just like as part of a visit to the wildlife area, it might be possible.
Nora, go for it there.
I noticed at the beginning of the presentation, there was something about other than birds having tags. Are there any monarch butterflies or any other species like that that are being tracked?
Yes, so there have been some monarchs that have been tracked using Motus. I think definitely in Southern Ontario. I'm not sure if there have been monarch tracking projects anywhere else, but I know that folks have tracked monarchs around Southern Ontario, I think in the Long Point area. And yeah, that's been possible with like the super small tags that have come out in the last few years. And that project that was tracking monarchs was also tracking green darner dragonflies. And I think that there may have been a project in Europe that just started tracking bumblebees. And then bats are probably after birds what's been tracked the most. So they've tracked little brown bats quite a bit in Ontario, and some other Motus species bats in Indiana, I think. And then they tracked eastern red bats, I think, migrating across Lake Erie using Motus. So they were trying to see if the bats were migrating across the water directly or going around the lake. And some of them were going right across. They've also been tracking silver-haired bats in Montana. And one of the other projects I work on is up in the Peace region in northeastern BC. And it's just getting started. So there's been one tag put out on a northern long-eared bat, but the plan is to track more bats using Motus up in the northeast, little brown and northern long-eared bat, and potentially some migratory tree roosting bats in the future.
Great, thank you.
Excellent question, Nora. I love it when questions aren't just birds. Good work, Nora. Check. I want one of these things in Langley. We don't have one in Langley, correct?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think there's some in Surrey, and then there's one in Abbotsford and one in Chilliwack, and kind of going out to Coquihalla. But I don't think there's one right in Langley.
Oh dear, we may need to work on that. Do you guys partner with like BC Nature to get more of these in, or?
I'm not sure whether there have been any partnerships with BC Nature specifically for Motus. I know Birds Canada has connections with BC Nature for some of our other work. I think specifically on key biodiversity areas. But in terms of Motus, I don't think so, at least not since I've been involved which is, I've been working for Birds Canada for a little less than 2 years now. But that would certainly be something to explore. And I'm not sure whether some of the other folks doing Motus in BC, because there's lots of others, they may have partnered with BC Nature. Yeah, some of the other groups working in BC using Motus are Environment Canada, which I mentioned, also Rocky Point Bird Observatory, Talioco Lake Bird Observatory, and Vancouver Island University started a project within the last years tracking northern saw-whet owls. Yeah, and then yeah, they just set up a bunch of new stations in the Okanagan to work on Lewis's woodpecker. So those are kind of a couple new developments.
Only one in Langley. Well, everyone, we all want one in Langley, right?
Yes, yes. What about Trinity Western? Maybe it could be at Trinity Western.
Yeah, where'd Ted go? There he is. What do you think, Ted? Some big bell towers at Trinity.
Trinity Western, the university.
I'm retired now, but I can use my intense power to. Yeah.
I like it.
Belta, what? I guess that's another issue, Amy. What about things like lightning strikes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, I try to ground the stations so that if they're struck by lightning, honestly, I think that the Motus station itself, the receiver part might be fried, but with grounding, there would hopefully be no damage to any infrastructure that it's installed on or anything. So for like I set up one station at the school in Richmond at Anderson Elementary on the roof there, and we just ran a ground wire to their existing ground system. And for other ones, I've driven ground rods to protect the structure that they're built on. However, that being said, I am certainly not an electrician, so I am doing my best to learn all this, but I absolutely welcome the advice of anyone who has more experience than I do in that area. For some stations that have been installed in like particular areas that are particularly prone to lightning strikes, in addition to ground rods and ground wires, they can install lightning suppressors as well.
It's not a major issue here. So.
Yeah.
So Langley could be a very good spot. Anne, were you putting up your hand?
I was just gonna be facetious, but I'm always wondering about our snow geese that always commute back and forth to Russia. I guess there's no way we're gonna get a Motus one in Russia now. On the Wrangel Island where the snow geese go.
I mean, as the current geopolitical situation, probably not, but I mean, snow geese are big enough that Motus probably isn't the best way to track them, because Motus it's great for like smaller birds that can't necessarily carry a satellite transmitter, but snow geese certainly could carry a satellite transmitter, and that'll give you maybe daily fixes of where they are. So you're probably going to get a lot more data points than you would from Motus, where they have to pass by a receiver to get detected.
The Russians would probably shoot them down because they'd be thinking they're spying on the Russians, right? I wouldn't go to, I wouldn't put that on the poor birds.
Don't send any Canadian geese in. Any more questions for Amy? No? Oh, Joanne?
Sorry, Amy, great presentation. Who did you say was studying the saw-whet owls?
Yeah, that's Rocky Point Bird Observatory, Tatleyoko Lake Bird Observatory, and Vancouver Island University. So I've talked to Anne Nightingale at Rocky Point Bird Observatory the most about it. And then I think Eric Demers is the prof at Vancouver Island University who's involved.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, that was an absolutely awesome presentation. I quite enjoyed that. Thank you so much, Amy. Really appreciate your time coming out. Well, as out as we get these days, but really appreciate your time. A round of applause for Amy.
Thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So everybody, hopefully we'll see you at, sorry, I wanted to call it Rivers Day. Earth Day, the Earth Day celebration for the city of Langley. And then after that, at the BioBlitz on May 1st. Take care, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.